All right. Good evening, everybody. Merry Christmas. Um, so
Happy
the topic of the class, as I announced it, is assisted suicide in Jewish law. It was a few weeks ago. Subsequently, in terms of doing more research for tonight's class, because this is an issue like, it's not fixed. There's evolution of people's thought all the time, and a preferred term now is aid in dying. So if I have in my notes, but aid in dying is really a more preferred term these days. Okay, so and I must stress that I come from this from the perspective of a rabbi. I'm not a medical ethicist. I mean, we have um, Mark Comrade is one of the leading people in the medical physician-assisted suicide, and he has traveled to many states and many countries, speaking to medical societies, speaking to legislatures, giving grand rounds at medical schools, but his perspective is that of a physician. I see Dr. Ann Berger, who's one of our country's leading palliative care physicians, is with us tonight, and her perspective. Obviously, both Dr. Comrade and Dr. Berger are Jews, but they come obviously from a perspective of a physician, whereas I am not a physician. I have some training in clinical medical ethics. I was a member of the bioethics committee of the WellSpan Health System in southeastern Pennsylvania. And I had to do some clinical ethical training for that. But, it's a different perspective. As always, welcome questions and what have you. Okay, so, that introduction is relevant because the fundamental assumptions between halakha and secular bioethics are different. I mean, in secular bioethics, autonomy is a key principle, okay? And this is something that has evolved really within a lifetime of most of us present tonight, right? I mean, it used to be that doctors would make decisions for the patient, and a doctor would decide not to even share your condition with you, and so on and so forth. And this evolution towards autonomy, right, where the role of the physician is not to decide for you, but to give you the tools to decide for yourself. And I will tell you that when I served, particularly, and this was in the late 90s, on the bioethics committee, and sometimes would be called in for a consult, and very often patients don't want that autonomy. Doctor, tell me what to do. Right? And the doctor would say, I can't tell you what to do. I can tell you what the alternatives are. I can tell you what likely outcomes may be, but ultimately you have to make that decision, right? And so, the fundamental ethos in secular bioethics, as it should be, is autonomy, right? Because why? Because we own ourselves. But in halakha, we do not own ourselves, right? God owns us. And that is a very fundamental difference. And therefore, your autonomy is limited because your body does not belong to you. It belongs to God. It's lent to you by God. And therefore, God is the has the right to determine what happens to it, right? Although, most of us do not believe that God directly intervenes, right? So otherwise, we wouldn't have to have this discussion because God would just decide and, Gamarna, we're done with it, right? But in terms of, but there is not an ethic of autonomy in halakha. Okay, now, suicide has been understood forever, really, to be forbidden by halakha, right? Um, Choose life, right? I've set before you this day blessing and curse, life and death. Choose life that you may live, right? And even the idea that we can transgress most of the mitzvot in order to preserve life is chai bahem. These are the mitzvot which you shall follow and live by them. And the rabbinic gloss is chai bahem v'lo sheyamut bahem, that you should live by them, not die because of them, right? And therefore, we are to transgress a mitzvah rather than to lose our lives, right? The only exceptions are if we are being forced to commit bloodshed, adultery, or idolatry. So generally, the idea is ya'avor va'al yahareg, let him transgress and not be killed. But if somebody is trying to force you to commit bloodshed, adultery, or idolatry, yahareg va'al ya'avor, you should let yourself be killed rather than transgress those three commandments, in which case it is death really for the sake of God. Okay, and a classic text, and I distributed the text. I tried to get the text to everybody who I thought might be in the class. But I also put links to the text in the chat box. Okay, and I noticed that twice instead of typing the word of, I typed the word or. Right, but the first text I want to look at is Martyrdom of Rabbi Hanina. So if you didn't get the links, or if you whatever, you can click on that and it should bring you to this text. Okay, so Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion was one of the 10 martyrs that were killed by the Roman Empire because they were studying and teaching Torah. And when we do the classic martyrology, we read the story of the 10 martyrs, and Hanina ben Tradion is one of the 10 martyrs. Okay, and so the background to this text is that he violated the Roman emperor's order not to teach Torah. He was caught teaching Torah and was sentenced to be burned at the stake. Okay, so they brought him to be sentenced. They wrapped him in the Torah scroll and encircled him with bundles of branches, and they set fire to it. And they brought tufts of wool and soaked them in water and placed them on his heart, so that his soul should not leave his body quickly, but he would die slowly and painfully. His daughter said to him, "Father, must I see you like this?" Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion said to her, "If I alone were being burned, it would be difficult for me. But now that I am burning along with the Torah scroll, he who will seek retribution for the insult according to the Torah scroll will also seek retribution for the insult accorded to me." His students said to him, "Our teacher, what do you see?" Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion said to them, "I see the parchment burning, but its letters are flying to the heavens." They said to him, "You too should open your mouth, and the fire will enter you, and you will die quickly." Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion said to them, "It is preferable that he who gave me my soul should take it away, and one should not harm oneself to speed his death." Okay, so I'm gonna pause here. in one or two sentences what's going on, relevance to, to our question, to the bioethical question of this passage. Anyone?
Oh, you want so
Yeah.
he is on the verge of death, wrapped in a scroll on a pyre, set on fire, and the question is, should his death be aided by him or his students or whomever? And he's saying, thank you anyway.
Exactly, right? He's being tortured to death, and the Romans have set it up so that his death will be slow and painful, right? So his students are saying, suck in the fire so that you'll die sooner, you'll suffer less. And he said, suicide is forbidden. Right? Suicide is forbidden even under these circumstances, right? So I can't, so even it's suicide, right? He's not gonna commit suicide. All right. So the executioner said to him, my teacher, if I increase the flame and take off the tufts of wool from your heart so that you will die sooner and suffer less, will you bring me to the life of the world to come? Okay, so presumably, right, the executioner has been like so at this point, I have to be faithful to God's law and not worry about my own suffering. So the executioner wants to now at this point spare him the suffering. So if I increase the flame and take off the tufts of wool, you will die sooner and suffer less. Will you bring me to the life of the world to come? Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion said to the executioner, yes. The executioner said, take an oath for me that what you say is true. Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion took the oath for him, and the executioner immediately increased the flame and took off the tufts of wool from his heart, causing his soul to leave his body quickly. The executioner too leaped and fell into the fire and died. A divine voice emerged and said, Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion and the executioner are destined for the life of the world to come. Okay, it's a difficult text,
right? Very.
Right?
You're frozen.
Side, right? And nevertheless, the executioner, even though he commits suicide, right, enters the world to come. Right now, of course, the executioner is not Jewish. He's a Roman legionnaire, right? And maybe there are different rules for that. But I am less interested in the execution. Hanina, right? I have no control over this, folks. It's my internet connection or my computer. There's really nothing that I can do about it. Okay, I'm sorry, but I don't run the internet. I'm more interested in what Rabbi Hanina has done, where he said, he cannot commit. Essentially, in terms of the concepts that we're talking about, right? He cannot actively commit suicide, but he will permit removal of an impediment to death.
Well, it was
right. That's essentially what he said. He's permitted the removal of. Excuse me.
It was even more than removing impediments. He encouraged or agreed to somebody taking active steps to facilitate his death.
Right, but
that was aided death.
Right, but the executioner was already killing him, right? I mean, that's why, it's not it's hard to translate this text into a hospital setting, right? Because the executioner was already killing him, but he was killing him in a way that was slow and painful. So I'm going to take away the tufts of wool, right? And I'm going to increase the flame, and you're going to die more quickly, right? Is that so? It's again, it's hard. I mean, I could have truncated the text and we wouldn't have these difficult discussions, but I didn't want to do that, right? Because I didn't want somebody to say, oh, Rabbi, you only brought half the text, right?
From a medical
So,
from a medical point of view, it's not that hard to understand that what you're doing there is, which is from a bioethical point of view, okay. If you're, let's say, on a ventilator and you remove the ventilator, that is permitted.
right. Like I said, to me, the fact that this is in the context of an execution makes it a little bit less clear. But the next text, I think, is exactly analogous. Um, exactly analogous. So when we get, all right. So, um,
Wait, once
Yeah.
you, I know it's not a hospital setting, but once you've given the ventilator, you cannot take a ventilator away from a person.
not necessarily.
Not
Um,
necessarily.
Not necessarily.
No, ventilators are removed all the time. And from an ethical point of
Yeah.
view, I don't know about Jewish ethics, but from an ethical point of view, there's nothing, it's not any worse, adding it than taking it away. But many times when things seem to be futile, we take the ventilator away, we discontinue it.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
do
I
that
mean,
every
I
day.
would say, right, I would say that this is in terms of ventilators, this was an area where halachic career, okay, because it used to be felt that once you put somebody on a ventilator, you cannot take them off, right? But the result was that people were reluctant to allow their relatives to be put on ventilators in the first. I have no obligation to put the ventilator on, but once putting it on, I can't take it off. That serves as a disincentive to put it on. Okay, so the thinking of halachis actually evolved, and most circumstances. I mean, and what the circumstances are, people may differ, but certainly if it's a case of brain death, and halacha does accept brain death as real death. So if it is a case of brain death and respiration continues, but the only reason that the respiration is continued is because of the ventilator, it's absolutely permitted to remove the ventilator. You may be able to find an outlier who says no, but the halachic consensus is that is okay. All right. So, but halacha, as I've said and I think I've demonstrated, has been clear that suicide is forbidden halachically. But in secular law, there has been a move away from making suicide illegal and recognizing it as a privacy right. The older common law prohibition of suicide was based on the idea that by committing suicide, you were depriving the sovereign of a subject. But increasingly, suicide is being seen as a mental health issue and not a criminal issue. And to the extent where there are states that still make suicide illegal, those laws are generally being repealed. Now, I don't know, Alan, you may know, is suicide illegal? I'm not talking about aid in dying or medically assisted suicide. I'm talking just in general, whether suicide is illegal in Maryland.
Initially.
You know, I should have checked it. I should have checked it today before I came in. But
Okay, we've lost.
I do.
All right, I'm gonna have to go on because now I've lost.
I don't
at
think it
least
is
I've lost.
illegal from that start for trying.
You froze also, Al.
I froze, but I'm using this. I don't think suicide. I don't think somebody would be prosecuted for
Right.
attempting suicide. I've never heard of that.
Okay, yeah. It's generally, as I said, it's generally seen as a mental health and not a criminal issue. Now, there is a book of Holocaust era responsa called Mehama Amakim, From the Depths, by Rabbi Ephraim Oshry. And during the Holocaust in the Kovno ghetto, Rabbi Oshry permitted someone to commit suicide because he was afraid that if he were tortured by the Nazis, he would reveal the whereabouts of other Jews, right? You understand? I'm afraid if I get caught by the Nazis, I will reveal information. They'll torture me. I'll reveal information. I would rather commit suicide. And he permitted him to commit suicide, but he did not permit his ruling to be published, to be made known. There's this concept called halacha ve'ein morin kain. Okay, this is the law, but we don't teach it, right? Because he was afraid, because this is the problem. I will tell you, having also been a municipal ethics commissioner, right, is that you know, we gave an advisory opinion that said something was legal, and then somebody else said, well, they said he could do that, so now I could do this, right? And the ruling is for a specific individual in a specific set of circumstances, and you don't have the right to go and decide on your own that ruling applies to you too, right? So he allowed it in this particular case, but he did not want it to be publicized, lest it might undermine the commitment of life of other Jews in the ghetto. Okay, now, historically, Judaism has forbidden the burial of suicides in Jewish cemeteries, but in recent times, we've reconsidered this because of the awareness of mental illness, and we have attributed such deaths to depression or schizophrenia rather than suicide per se, right? And I have, you know, you're a rabbi long enough, you're going to eventually be faced with funerals of people who have died by suicide, and it is absolutely not an issue, right? I mean, we understand that it's not, you know, you were killed, essentially you were killed by the mental illness from which you suffered. And there is no issue whatsoever about burying such a person today in a Jewish cemetery. But that is a post facto decision about what to do with the body of somebody who has committed suicide. And it's not an ab initio permission to go ahead and do it, right? I mean, that's the difference. Yes, if you commit suicide, we will still bury you in the Jewish cemetery. That's not to say, yeah, sure, go ahead and commit suicide, right? I mean, now, some people mistakenly believe that halakha requires us to do every possible medical intervention to preserve life at all costs, right? This is not correct. I mean, you probably heard that, right? Halakha requires you to do everything possible to keep a person alive. Is absolutely not so, okay? And again, in a hospital ethics setting, there may well be conflict between members of the same family, between the family and the medical staff, because they believe that their religion requires them to do everything. And as a general, look, I can't speak for every religion. I can speak for Judaism, and I can, because of some of my own background training, also pretty authoritatively say that Roman Catholicism also does not require you to do every possible medical intervention, right? Patients and their families actually have a great deal of latitude because almost every medical treatment has a downside as well. And we are allowed to weigh costs and benefits for ourselves. For example, someone could legitimately refuse chemo or surgery on the basis that they don't want to suffer from the pain of recovery or of the debilitating side effects, but not on the basis that they simply want to die. Okay. So, for example, in my own mom's case, I mean, she, about 3.5 years ago, cancer that she had had a number of times recurred. This time it was in her brain. And they said, well, we could just take it out. And then she said, no, I'm done. And, my brother and I, who come from very different perspectives, right? My brother's an active leader of his Unitarian congregation. I'm a conservative rabbi. We both agreed that that was an appropriate decision for her. She just did not want to go through all that pain. That at that point, she felt that the cost versus benefit was simply not worth it. And she entered a course of palliative care. And in my mom's typical way, they told her, well, if we don't treat it, you probably have a month to live. And 4 months later, she passed away. But, which is, anyway. So furthermore, halakha recognizes a difference between active killing on the one hand and removing an impediment to death on the other. Okay. And that's where the sort of the locus classicus is the story of the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Okay. So let's look at that. Okay. So this is from the Talmud Ketubot 104a. It is related on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi died, the sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die. And they said, anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi has died will be stabbed with a sword. The maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi ascended to the roof and said, the upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and the lower realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. May it be the will of God that the lower worlds should impose their will upon the upper worlds. However, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom and remove his tefillin and then exit and put them back on, and how he was suffering with his intestinal disease, she said, may it be the will of God that the upper worlds should impose their will upon the lower worlds. And the sages, meanwhile, would not be silent. They would not refrain from begging for mercy so that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi would not die. So she took a jug and threw it from the roof to the ground. Due to the sudden noise, the sages were momentarily silent and refrained from begging for mercy, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi died, right? So in other words, right? So the only thing keeping him alive is the prayer of the sages, right? So his maid saw how much he was suffering. She went up to the roof. She threw a jug down. The jug broke. Startled the sages. They momentarily stopped praying. Yehuda Hanassi died, right? In this, that is exactly analogous to removing the respirator, right? In this case, right? The respirator in this case is the prayer of the sages, right? Was permitted to die, right? And there is no sense whatsoever that the Gemara condemns this, right? And then there's more, but we don't have to. It's not directly relevant. You can sort of read it at your leisure. Okay, so all right, so you can remove an impediment to death, and you do not have to engage in every possible medical intervention, right? Therefore, halacha fully supports hospice and palliative care and the right of a terminal patient to refuse treatment. Okay, there's also, and this is less sort of unchallenged, but most halachic authorities recognize what's known as the principle of dual effect, right? In other words, I give you a lot of pain medication to keep you comfortable, right? Now, there's an art to this, right? It is possible that I will give you so much pain medication that the way it will prevent the pain is by
Killing you.
killing you,
Mhm.
right? But it's not my intention to kill you, right? It's not, and again, this is a principle of dual effect, and most halachis understand this, right? It is permissible to give a lot of morphine to reduce severe pain, even at the risk of death, as long as it is not the intention to bring about death, okay? And this is pretty much clear black letter halachic law, but perhaps circumstances have changed, right? And certainly societally, I think circumstances have changed. I mean, I can tell you that a number of years ago, an organization, I think it's called Compassionate Choices, made a presentation to the Washington Board of Rabbis, urging the Board of Rabbis to support the Maryland aid in dying law. Okay. Now, I will tell you that the Board of Rabbis is never going to take a position on that law, because the more liberal rabbis generally support it. Orthodox rabbis unanimously oppose it, and most conservative rabbis oppose it as well. Right. Having said that, I mean, every year this law is brought up. So far, every year it's failed, but it fails only by, 1 or 2 votes. And it is often Jewish legislatures who are affirmatively Jewish, like Cheryl Kagan, who used to be a Jewish communal professional. She worked, I think, for BBYO for a number of years, is usually one of the sponsors in the House. In the Senate, our Kirill Resnick is this one of the sponsors in the House, in the Assembly, and I always, and it shows that you can disagree with your legislator on some issues and still, support them generally. So every year, all of the legislators from our district are co-sponsors of this legislation. And every year I send them a letter in my own name, not on behalf of the congregation, opposing this legislation, right? But in general, one could say that the liberal or progressive perspective, because it supports autonomy, right, has been supportive of these types of legislations, right? So in 1997, the Law Committee of the Conservative Movement reconsidered this, and Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is the leading medical ethicist in the conservative movement, and I would say one of the leading medical ethicists in the world as a whole, came up with a responsum that was approved that says, No. Okay. And there are additional reasons, according to Rabbi Dorff, to be opposed to these kind of laws, right? He says it is a social statement against the American tendency to view ourselves and our lives in utilitarian terms. In Judaism, the value of life does not come from the level of our abilities, but from the image of God in each of us. Second point, under conditions of managed care, permission to take one's life will easily transform into the obligation to take one's life, right? In other words, and I have to say, maybe I'm cynical, right? But I have no doubt that if aid in dying were to be legal, insurance companies are going to start putting pressure on people to choose aid in dying, right? Because the shot, the shot of a couple of pills is a lot cheaper than days, weeks, months of care. Now, I will say all of these laws have safeguards against it, right? All these laws have safeguards against it, but we know that just because something is legal doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? And and even if and Rabbi Dorff also says it's not just insurance companies, but I mean, families also, mom, she's not going to get better, why should we waste all this money on her care when it could go to pay for college for the kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And all of these things I think are, in my opinion, are realistic. Okay, so Rabbi Dorff says we should not be asking whether one may aid another in dying. We should rather explore what prompts people to seek to die in the first place. And then we should remove these motivations through proper pain medication and through attentive care. Okay, now, that was in 1997. Rabbi Dorff serves on the bioethics committee of, I think, UCLA Medical Center. I mean, he's, like I say, he's an active bioethicist. He's not simply, a professor sitting in an ivory tower somewhere. And he said that in the last 20 some odd years, through being on floors, he's understood that the situation is not, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the situation is not always so black and white, that there are cases where palliative care simply cannot control the pain. That, people are terminal and they are in tremendous pain, and the palliative care medical staff are, doing everything that they can, and the pain simply cannot be controlled. Okay, and so he just last month wrote another responsum, a reconsideration, which was fairly narrowly passed, 9 votes in favor, 5 against, 2 abstention. That says this responsum allows patients to request drugs to bring about their death when they suffer from uncontrollable pain and can administer the drugs themselves. It also permits physicians to provide the drugs needed for this purpose. It does not authorize physicians to administer the drugs themselves. Nevertheless, after the fact, if physicians have done so, rabbis and others should stand aside without judgment. Rabbis and others should provide support and comfort for patients and their families facing this condition, no matter how the patient dies. Okay, and then he goes on to say, I'm not going to read everything that he wrote, but he is now willing to say that this is halachically appropriate under very rare and very specific circumstances. Care has to be made that nobody is putting pressure on the patient to choose something that they really don't want. Also, that doctors must have the right to say, this is something that I am unwilling to do, right? In other words, just because it's allowed doesn't mean that any particular doctor is required to do it. But in that case, you should refer to another doctor who is willing to do this. And then he adds, all of these provisions apply only in those civil jurisdictions that permit aid in dying, right? I mean, in other words, it may be halachically appropriate under certain circumstances. If it's illegal, it's still illegal, right? And you know, you can't say, well, halacha allows it, so you know, so I should be allowed to do it, right? Now, so all of this is
Rabbi, quick question, Rabbi Dor. I mean, I've heard him lecture. He's conservative, or when he wrote this response, is he conservative? What is
yeah,
he?
he's a conservative rabbi. Yeah,
Okay.
he's a conservative rabbi, and generally, I would say within the spectrum of the conservative movement on the liberal end. Okay,
Okay.
on the liberal end of the conservative movement. For example, I mean, and it's hard to track. I mean, not every issue fits neatly into right-left dichotomies, right? But Rabbi Dorff was supporting the ordination of gays and lesbians as rabbis and cantors, when frankly people like me thought that that was unthinkable. I know for many years have no longer thought that to be unthinkable, but he's, you know, often kind of ahead of the curve.
Well,
But
and physician-assisted suicide is not the physician doing it. Physician-assisted suicide, in the places that it is legal, the patient actually has to do it themselves.
right, and that's what he
So
says.
Right. So like with ALS, it's a big thing. There are a lot of patients with ALS who end up wanting to do it, but they have to do it when they're still able to do it, or people with
Right.
brain tumors. You know,
Right.
not when they're comatose and seizing. They have to be able to physically take the medicine.
Right. No, and that again is part of the problem, is that you have to be, you know, you have to be physically able to do it. Okay. Now, none of this deals with, you know, the question of what civil or what state law should be, right? I have spoken simply about halacha, okay? And I frankly, I mean, I read Rabbi Dorff's new response, and as I said, it was only passed last month. Most rabbis have had other halachic issues on their radar screen. I was not even aware of this until a couple of days ago. I don't know if I agree with him or not, frankly. I mean, when I say I don't know, I mean I don't know. I haven't had enough time to digest it, right? But the conservative movement has not taken a position on you know, what the law should be, right? This is all a question of what the halakha is, right? Now, here's where I want to talk a little bit from personal experience, right? Because most of these laws say that a person has to have a terminal illness and, you know, be given a prognosis of less than 6 months to, okay. Now, perhaps, you know, we all bring our own experience, but 6 months to live in 1975, and that prognosis was off by only 42 years. He died in 2017, right? In 2011, she was on her deathbed. I mean, I received a call from Sloan Kettering, and that was 2011, and she died 6 years later, right? So when somebody says, well, it's only somebody who has 6 months to live, I don't know how you know that somebody has 6 months to live, right? And it's just very, very inexact, right? But here now here is where I want to throw it open, because and that's why I said in my email at the beginning of the week, right? I would like you to give some thought about the interplay between halakha and secular law, right? Because I have to tell you, I mean, have been for years very actively opposed to aid in dying legislation. And I approach that, obviously from my own experience, but also from my own perspective of what the halakha says, right? But the question is, and it's a real question, it's an open question, to what extent should we insist that Maryland law track halakha? I mean, we go crazy, right? I mean, the last two sessions we dealt with abortion, right? And the Catholic position on abortion is clear, right? But it frustrates us that Catholics and evangelicals take their position arrived at through their own religious thought process and try to make it law, right? Say I'm not, because I'm doing it as an individual, right? Again, I mean the boards of rabbis will take no position on this, because boards of rabbis take positions only where there's almost wall-to-wall agreement, right? And certainly, when I write to my legislatures, it's as an individual, it's not as the rabbi of Kehilat Shalom. But the question of the interplay between halakha and civil law is problematic to me, and I'm not sure. Frankly, I just throw that out as something that I'm not really clear on. So I throw it open.
Rabbi, just a question. It's really fascinating to me. Bobby and I have been arguing for a while over I kept telling her you're going to teach this based on halakha, and she says, but what do I care about halakha? I want to know what Jewish views are today in the 21st century. And so to try and to understand that there are two, and then to try and fit them together. But looking at what you said tonight, you
Right.
gave us two pieces to read. I could argue both of them argue in favor of assisted dying. I don't know if that was your intention, but you could argue it either way. But with putting those aside, the bulk of what you said, I wasn't sure it was where in halakha it all came from. It was because it's really hard when you're talking ethics and you're a rabbi, or when we're talking ethics, and you say it's Jewish ethics, but what are you folding into that word? It's not like halakha lays out, at least you haven't told us, that halakha lays out obviously and totally how to act, and then we are faced with the 21st century as outsiders and we have to deal with it. It's not quite that. It's exactly opposite of what I expected to hear tonight.
Well, all right. So first of all, I mean, if you read the second source in particular as allowing aid in dying, then I have not taught it well.
The second
Okay,
source
because
was the
by aid in dying, we mean I mean, there's a difference, okay? And I maybe should have been more clear. Aid in dying means providing a person with the means to commit suicide, okay? Taking away a ventilator is not aid in dying. Giving somebody, you know, I don't even know what meds would be used, but you know, giving somebody the pills that they would take to cease their respiration, that's aid in dying.
Sure.
All right, taking away the respirator is not what I mean. Taking away the respirator, again, it depends on the circumstances, but there's no blanket prohibition on taking away the respirator. Halachically, there's a blanket prohibition against a person committing suicide under any circumstances, except, you know, you're being tortured by the Nazis and you're afraid that you'll turn in other Jews, right? I mean, it's not something that any of us have to worry about, right? But thank God. But other than that, suicide is forbidden, and assisting people to do what the halacha forbids is also forbidden, right? In other words, you know, if I tell my Jewish neighbor, you know, we're on the way to Wegmans, you want me to pick up something for you, and they say, yeah, you know, go into the butcher shop and get me 2 pounds of pork chops. I can't do that, right? I'm not allowed to aid another Jew in doing something that is forbidden, right? So therefore, if I were a Jewish physician, I would not be allowed to aid a person in committing suicide.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Okay, so I guess I clearly, so thank you for asking the question, because it gives me the opportunity to clarify. Okay, when we talk about aid in dying, we mean helping people to commit suicide. We do not mean,
Which is anti-halacha. Gotcha.
right, we do not mean removing impediments to death.
Can
Sue,
I ask a question?
yes, please
How
do.
far does that go as to your obligation? I know of a situation where, and I know personally of a situation where somebody decided they wanted to die and they were going to stop eating, and their child did not do anything to prohibit that because they felt this was her decision, was this person's mother. She had made the decision, she did not want to live anymore, and she just was going to stop eating. Should
Right.
he have had to go and force her intravenously or do something to keep her eating? Or
Right.
was he allowed? And by the way, this happened to be a very religious Jew. So,
Right. Okay. So that is one of the questions where there is not a unanimous halachic perspective. Okay. I mean, there are some who would say, and even within the conservative movement, okay, are some who would say that you really have to provide, you know, nutrition and hydration even against a patient's will. Others would say that that's a medical intervention, and that people have a right to refuse medical intervention. You know, I would say, I mean, and again, not being a physician, right? But from the whole, I would say that the obligation, first of all, is to make sure that the person is receiving the appropriate both medical and psychological or spiritual care, right? In other words, a lot of times when people express a desire to die, or they stop eating or whatever, there's depression there, and that depression could be treated. Um, but I can't, I mean, I would say that my own perspective is that once you have ruled out depression as the reason why the person has stopped eating, that should be respected. That certainly, I don't see any benefit in force feeding somebody who is terminally ill. But other rabbis would disagree, and I think that is a legitimate dispute within halacha, right?
Well-
Similarly, it's not. I mean, we spoke about the respirator, but Rabbi Dorf, for example, if somebody said, I'm on a feeding tube, but I want it taken out, Rabbi Dorf would allow it. Rabbi Avram Reisner, who is a more conservative halachist, would not allow it. And if you look at the halachic advanced directives, they say, this is available only to people who support Rabbi Dorf's position, but if you support Rabbi Reisner's position, it's not an appropriate option to choose. Dee, did you have a question?
I was just going to say that the more you explain or provide details, the more painfully conflicted I am, because I've personally lived through a number of these situations, young and elderly. But one of the things that made me even more than the emotional part, made me do a lot of heavy thinking about all of this, is because of the suffering that I've seen in my family. So looking at the screen and seeing at least two lawyers here, it brings to mind that I was working with a very sensitive lawyer who spent a lot of time explaining to me about medical advanced directives.
Right.
And I mean, right down to, it's one thing to talk to somebody in the hypothetical or in the actual, but in the future. So when you're talking to a healthy 30-year-old about an advanced directive, it's not the same as when you're talking to somebody who's 75 or 80 and has watched this happen. But when they talk about, here's what I want you to think about, here's what I want you to specify, and then you talk about, do you want heroic measures or don't you want heroic measures? And they get right down to, you can ask to have food withheld, you can ask to have hydration withheld. It's one thing to just say, click, click, click. It's another thing when the person goes into detailed explanation of how you will suffer as you are asking for these things to be withheld. And no matter what little box you click on these advanced directives, the outcome and level of suffering in order to speed up your dying is as horrific as if you're trying to tell somebody to go to palliative care or whatever. I'm not doing a good job of explaining this, but it was one of the most painful. I mean, I'm having a hard time with this discussion tonight. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but the things that I have seen have not left me. And the more I hear these discussions and the conflict, and actually, when I was going through all of these, I'm not going to say that I'm a religious Jew, but I am certainly a comeback Jew who's trying very hard to become more religious or observant, or at least knowledgeable. So the conflict now for me is even more difficult than when I wasn't aware of the issues of halakha, except for the fact that suicide is a no-no. But to put it more in layman terms of things you've discussed, I certainly won't mention who the attending physician was, who is a very, very highly respected medical professional and a very dear friend. And in my mom's last days, he actually came to the home after she was sent home. And we had been through many horrific things with her. And what he showed us was how she was under medication just to try to minimize pain and let her sleep. And he showed us how to, God forgive me for relaying this, dial back the amount of oxygen that was flowing through the machine for her, not to keep her from breathing, but just not to keep things going at the pace that they were, so that she could just literally fall off to sleep. And of all the things that I experienced, we did not do that, but of all the things that I experienced, that was the most gentle, most humane approach and this was not from a Jewish doctor.
Right.
And it was from a doctor who was emotionally invested in my mother. So it was among the most compassionate things that we had been through. And I don't know where that puts that in the perspective of today's discussion or even of civil law versus halakha, but it's just another perspective on the issue.
No, look, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I said at the very beginning is that, you know, every situation is individual, right? And um, you know, it's one of the reasons why, I mean, good palliative care looks not just at the physical, but also at the spiritual, right? Because it's all interrelated. And you know, if once you get involved in a situation, if you're not conflicted, then I think that you have a problem, frankly. Um, and I, you know, and yet, I mean, you know, there are situations where, you know, this idea of halacha ve'ein morin kain, right? That this is the law, but we don't teach it, right? Or, you know, somebody does something that technically, legally, they shouldn't do, and we look the other way, right? And I could justify looking the other way. But then what about all the, I'll give you an analogy. Okay, I'll give you an analogy. Up until a couple of years ago, the Rabbinical Assembly said that a conservative rabbi could not even attend an intermarriage. All right. If you attended an intermarriage, you would be kicked out. Right. But it was never enforced. It was never enforced. And some people knew that it was never enforced, and other people did not know that it was never enforced. Okay. So when we had a regional meeting where it was made, when they were discussing whether to get rid of that rule, and you know, and I said, well, you know, when my brother got married, I called the RA office, and they basically said, if you go, we'll look the other way, right? And somebody else there said, well, I wish they had told me that, because I didn't go to my brother's wedding either, and my brother hasn't spoken to me for 10 years, right? So this is the problem. Right? When you say, well, you shouldn't do it, but we'll look the other way if you do. Some people are rule followers and some people are not rule followers, right? And you know, it's a problem. And I absolutely, I mean, endorse everything that you've said. It's a very joke. If these issues don't cause you some conflict, I think that that's a problem, frankly. Yeah. All right. Dr. Berger.
It's also, I mean, the whole thing is very complicated because I can tell you from palliative care physicians, um, you know, from a palliative care point of view, most of the societies, palliative care doctors, palliative care nurses, have come out with this is not something, you know, we really want to be part of. Now in Canada, it's legalized everywhere. And so in Canada, the palliative care doctors are part of this and
Right.
are the ones um, giving the medication to the patient. Our younger palliative care fellows, one of them was working in California. She wanted to work with the ALS patients, and the neurologist said, "Oh, this is great. Yeah, you could start working with us." And he didn't see it as my ALS patients needs palliative care. It was, how can you help them with assisted suicide if that's what they asked for?
Right.
So it's very complicated because the pain that palliative care cannot take care of is not physical pain.
Mhm.
And it's usually not even emotional pain. Frankly, it's spiritual pain.
Right.
And that's not pain that we have the ability to take care of. So, two on my team, a physician and a nurse who are kind of my age, both Catholic, will never, they said they would retire sooner than be involved in this, and they can't even talk about it. I don't know if I would want to be the one giving the medication, but certainly can understand why there is a need for this.
Yeah.
And have told my kids, this is how far I would be fine unless I cognitively wasn't okay. I have lots of physical disabilities. I don't care if I'm in a wheelchair or on a vent, because I'm already on a vent. But if I cognitively wasn't, I'm not okay, I would want to do something. I would want to take something. So again, I can see where there would be a need.
Yeah.
And
No,
the whole death thing, whether it's withdrawal of care or at end of life, is messy. I mean,
Mhm.
it's not this, it's not easy. And frankly, for me, where it became even clearer why this was almost beautiful at times was when we just had to put our almost 19-year-old Shih Tzu to sleep. We had to do it for our Bichon 9 years ago. He had dementia, and that was actually very painful for me. It was shortly after my dad had died of Parkinson's.
right.
For this dog, it was beautiful. He had had a quality of life. The last 8 months, Carl was changing dressings. He had tumors and stuff, but he was still eating. He was with us. And then when he finally couldn't walk and basically woke up and couldn't walk and couldn't stand and said, I can't do it anymore, and laid in our arms, we knew it was the right thing.
Right.
And I walked away and I said, oh my God, this is the right thing sometimes.
Right. I mean,
So.
and
I mean, I'm happy, and I'd love to see Dr. Rabbi Dorf's response up, because he's he's one of the top rabbi
yeah,
ethicists.
and I was going to say that he goes on quite at length actually about the difference between Canadian law and California law. And he is okay with the California law. He is not at all okay with the Canadian law. So I can send you a copy of the latest reconsideration. Drop me an email and I'll send you a copy. But Dorf. No, I mean, I'm fortunate in that I not only read him, I know him. I mean, I was his assistant for a year at the University of Judaism. So we have a relationship. And I think in the conservative movement, there, and I would say in the world, there's nobody better. I mean, it doesn't mean I agree with him on every issue, but he knows his stuff, and because he has the clinical experience as well. And it's funny because people talk in our society like flip-flopping, right? And what do you do if you figure out that you were wrong? Should you stick with it because you don't want to be accused of flip-flopping? I mean, he wrote something, more than 20 years ago, 23 years ago, and he realized that what he wrote was either wrong or the circumstances had changed, and he reconsidered it. And that's and again, I say, I don't know that I actually agree with him, but I haven't had the chance to digest it. But the fact that he was willing to say, well, I wrote that 23 years ago, and I don't 100% agree with everything that I wrote then, I think is a very brave thing. Absolutely.
In DC, it is permitted, and there's a palliative care doctor who's also an attorney
Right.
who does do it.
Right. All right.
When
Anyone
patients
else?
ask us, we send them there.
Yeah, I have another perspective coming from a different team that was taking care of another member of my family. And I'm finding in the last few years that more and more medical professionals who are dealing with any number of critical illnesses are talking. And actually, I want to back up and say, when I was working for Johns Hopkins University Medical School in Baltimore hired Johns Hopkins School of Education, a couple people in my program, to come to Baltimore to teach doctors and medical students how to talk to students, to patients. And And I mean, absolutely no disrespect or cynicism here at all. But starting with the fact that when you're dealing with a patient, particularly somebody who's in pain or seriously ill, not only can they not understand the medical and Latin lingo that's used, but they really want to know the essence of what's going on. And then adding to it an empathetic touch, which not everybody has. And most of us know that there's a difference between empathy and sympathy.
Right.
But the issue is that more and more doctors, because it's not a course that's taught, or at least at that point was not taught in medical school, but more and more doctors are learning that it's very important to be able to make sense as best possible with a patient about the difference between quantity of life and quality of life.
Right.
And that kind of ties into what you were alluding to with your dog. We went through a similar thing. And the question always remains, how do you know when it's time to go? Or how do you know when it's time, in the case of a pet, euthanasia?
Right.
One of the things that I found was in 3 cases in my family, these family members knew that it was time for them. And my mom was an example. She said, just please let me go to sleep. And that's another level that, you know, people who've been fortunate enough not to lose anybody hasn't experienced. But when somebody that you love deeply says, not in screaming pain and definitely coherent, please just let me go to sleep. That's something now that doctors are having a much different approach to than years ago.
Right. But I would say this, there's a difference between let me go to sleep and make me go to sleep.
I'm not suggesting otherwise. Yes.
No, and this is where, and I mean, you made a lot of important points. So I just want to address a couple. One is that I would, you know, with pets, it's a whole different issue because, look, I mean, as most of you know, it was 3 months ago that we had our dog euthanized as well. And Kelly and I actually believe that he told us it was time to go.
My point exactly.
Right. But, you know, it's not the same thing. I mean, it's not the same moral. I mean, we eat animals. We don't eat other, you know, we kill. And from my perspective, there's no difference in intelligence between a dog and a cow. And I eat beef, you know. But your first point in communication is very, very important. I mean, I found, you know, when I was on the bioethics committee in York, that 50% of the cases that came to the bioethics committee were not really bioethics cases, they were miscommunication cases, right? Where the medical staff member was simply not able to speak to the family in terms that the family could hear. And I've always said that, you know, for me, I mean, I do not consider myself very much of an original thinker, but I'm really good at taking complicated material and making it intelligible to people with less training in that field than I have. And I think that skill is something that, you know, many medical professionals, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if I have a very complicated disease and my choice is a physician who's very technically proficient, but maybe not a great communicator, and somebody who's a great communicator, but maybe not as technically proficient, I'll go with the technically proficient, right? But there should be somebody on the staff whose job it is to communicate in an intelligible and compassionate way with the patient and their family. And sometimes, particularly in research hospitals, that doesn't happen. It doesn't always happen. And that's a problem. So that's a very valid and important point.
I mean,
Right.
certainly in palliative care, you know, palliative care is we communicate and we
Right.
teach communication. More and more it's being taught and it's being made mandatory in medical schools.
Right.
But I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens after this whole pandemic,
Yeah,
because particularly young residents are on the front lines and thrown into this and dealing with 3,000 people dying a day.
right.
And they have to communicate with families in a way that even for palliative care people,
Right.
it's difficult because the family isn't there. It's on Zoom.
Right.
And I think this is going to be a whole different
I
generation
agree.
because of the horribleness of what they have just seen,
Yeah.
essentially a war. And I do think it's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
I see in speaking with, my son and his partner, they're different because they're in New York and, it's been bad.
Yeah. All right. On that happy note, we've gone way over, which is fine. I mean, we don't hold that it's forbidden to learn Torah tonight, so we've learned. We've learned, and thank you for a very good discussion of some difficult stuff. And if this has brought up anything for you and you want to follow up, feel free, email, phone, whatever, and we can chat more. So good night, everybody.
Thank you. And
Good
yes,
night.
Everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
really good
Thank you.
class.
Thanks.
Yes,
Yeah.
excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Stay well, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.